encourage you all to join. There are many other events upcoming. IPS has three new books out, one by John Pfeffer called The Pandemic Pivot, one by Chuck Collins called The Wealth Hoarders, and one by my wife Robin Rod and me called The Water Defenders. And there are events around all of those coming up. As you're seeing nice photos of the different panelists here. We're going to be joined by 7 of our IPS public scholars who are going to give different reactions to Biden's first 100 days. So thank you for joining that. And we, as you can imagine, we have a lot to discuss because a lot has happened in these 100 days. Just to give you a quick preview, we're going to break this conversation in half. We're going to spend half of the time talking about domestic policy developments under the Biden administration in the last 100 days, and half of it on foreign policy issues. And we'll be starting just in a moment when we get to the 4 p.m. We're going to get started now. Welcome to this webinar on Biden's first 100 days. I'm John Cavanna. I'm the director of the Institute for Policy Studies, and we want to welcome all of you for joining us today, just a few hours before President Biden offers details of his newest proposal, the American Families Plan, before Congress this evening. For those of you who don't know IPS, we are, get ready for this, entering our 58th year of working with dynamic social movements for peace, justice, and the environment. And in this work, we're proud to serve as the research arm of the Poor People's Campaign, to be the co-chair of a policy council of the Congressional Progressive Caucus Center. We encourage you all to subscribe to our IPS newsletter, which comes out once a week. And we also have newsletters, one on inequality at inequality.org. John Pfeffer's here, who edits our foreign policy in focus, fpif.org newsletter, and follow us on social media. So today, you're joining us to step back for a set of diverse perspectives on Biden's first 100 days. And we're going to be talking both about what we think Biden has gotten right on key issues during these days and where he needs to go bolder and further over the next 100 days, and how we and progressive movements can press the administration to do that. As the 8 of us were talking about this event and preparing for it, we realized there's a lot to talk about. So different of the panelists are going to get into different of the highlights of these first 100 days, from the first 10 days where Biden signed over 50 executive actions, to the 1.9 trillion COVID relief bill, which gave some of you a $1,400 check and also funded quite a number of other things, to the administration's, a lot of it reaction to the continuing dynamics around systemic racism in this country, particularly in the Black community and in the Asian American Pacific Islander community. And then, very relevant to right now, the new proposals this month from the Biden administration for what they're calling an American Jobs Plan and an American Families Plan that total for them, over $4 trillion in new spending that Congress and the nation will be debating over the next 3 months. So for this discussion, for those who've just joined, we're going to divide it into 2 parts. This first part, I'm going to be joined by 4 of these wonderful people that you see on your screen to talk about domestic policy issues over the past 100 days. And then we will shift to foreign policy issues with 3 others. The people many of you know are amazing IPS public scholars, but you're about to hear from in this order. First, Karen Dolan, the director of our Criminalization of Race and Poverty program. Then Rebecca Entralgo, the managing editor of IPSsinequality.org. Then Basav Sen, the director of IPS's Climate Policy program. And then Ashik Siddiq, a research analyst for the National Priorities Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. You also see up on your screen Phyllis Bennis, the director of our New Internationalism program, John Pfeffer, the director of Foreign Policy and Focus at IPS, and Currie Peterson-Smith, the IPS Michael Ratner Middle East Fellow. Since we at IPS don't see a strong distinction between domestic and foreign policy, they may weigh in when we get to the discussions. So the only other rule I want to throw out here is we are encouraging people, as you hear things, or if you're not hearing things you want to hear, go to that Q&A box, if you could, and type in your questions. Because after we hear about 3 minutes from each of the 4 domestic policy folks, we're going to open it up to a conversation from all of you. So without any further ado, let me turn it over first to Karen Dolan, director of IPS's Criminalization of Race and Poverty project. Karen.
Thank you so much, John. I'm going to read my remarks just so that I can stay on track and on time, so please forgive that. But Joe Biden came into office during a devastating global pandemic, a deep economic crisis, a nation hurting from a racist police system, a nation traumatized by 4 years of damaging and ruthless rule, vicious transphobia, and a rise in white nationalist and white supremacist domestic terrorism, including an attack on the Capitol, and all with only a slim majority in both chambers of Congress. He had 2 choices: govern from a mythical middle that would do just about nothing structurally to address these overlapping crises, or step boldly into the moment and reassert a role for effective government informed by social movements and get the change for which people have been so desperate. On issues related to the pandemic and the economy, Biden chose to boldly meet the moment. And he is choosing to pay for it by more fairly taxing the wealthiest people and corporations who have unfairly been taking advantage of corporate loopholes, of regressive tax policies, and of cheating for decades. I'm greatly encouraged by the executive actions that John mentioned that I won't go into here, but we can talk about in question and answer, and by the boldness the Biden administration has demonstrated in the American Rescue Plan, and further encouraged by continued bold visions of infrastructure remedies in the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan. The nearly $2 trillion American Rescue Plan was packed with necessary help for poor, low-income, moderate-income people, and small and minority-owned businesses, and COVID health measures. There was deliberate racial and gender equity lens employed in the targeting of the relief. There are many terrific policies. Here are some to note: an effective plan for vaccine distribution and COVID-related health care with a focus on the most impacted populations, a significant expansion of tax credits that would finally reach the extremely impoverished all the way up to the middle class, substantial though temporary improvement in access to human needs like food assistance, housing assistance, health care, as well as temporary fixes to the unemployment insurance systems. His American Jobs Plan is a 21st century infrastructure plan with attention to broadband, education, the caring economy, climate justice, with more and good paying jobs at the center, again with a focus on equity. Tonight, he'll unveil the American Families Plan. Some items of significance are universal pre-K, paid family and medical leave, and robust funding for childcare, and free community college, and again, with a focus on equity. More needs to be done. Though the child care proposal is desperately needed, it must be expanded to age 13, not simply up to age 5. The proposal for increased building and refurbishing of affordable housing is long overdue. However, missing is the funding stream for housing vouchers so that low-income people can access that housing. The unemployment insurance improvements are necessary, but we also need to mandate that states replace a far greater percentage of workers' wages than any of them currently do, that all workers are included, and that triggers are effective and that they last as long as they need to. We need Medicare for all and a fix for the obscene drug overpricing. Also, Biden has yet to come through on immigration, refugees, criminal justice reform, canceling student debt, doing more for U.S. territories, raising the estate tax, slashing the Pentagon budget, and more. I applaud Joe Biden for going big and bold in long overdue structural overhauls to our economy and toward addressing systemic racial, gender, and LGBTQIA inequities, and for surrounding himself with social movement advocates. And he needs to understand where he fell short and make maximum use of what may well be the one generational chance we have to move much further toward an equitable society. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Karen. It's fascinating to hear Karen say this now versus a year ago when Joe Biden was a candidate. So this is an intriguing moment to be having this conversation. We turn next to Rebecca and Tralgo. IPS goes deep on a number of issues. One of them is inequality. She's the managing editor of our inequality.org. Take it away, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you, Karen, for that amazing overview. I'm about to go in a little bit deeper onto one of the aspects that you touched on, which is the care economy. And I think the Biden administration deserves, some praise for working so closely with advocates on the issue of building a strong care economy for both families as well as workers. The funding numbers proposed by the administration are directly lifted from advocacy groups who work closely with those most affected by this issue. The administration has proposed a $400 billion investment to expand access to quality, affordable home-based care for aging and disabled Americans in its American Jobs Plan. And that's the biggest investment in the care economy that has ever been made before. And this will allow millions of people who need care to stay in their homes and avoid unnecessary placements in nursing homes, over 70% of which are for profit and paid for by private investors. And while there's been much, hemming and hawing over what is considered infrastructure, I think the Biden administration has rightly acknowledged that care work is a vital part of our nation's infrastructure. Both the traffic on your morning commute and a morning without a home health aide or childcare worker can make you late for work and has a tangible impact on your life. And we've seen throughout the pandemic that when we don't have a strong care infrastructure, care work primarily falls on women, which is why last year we saw what experts describe as the first women's recession, where working mothers were pushed out of the labor force due to caregiving responsibilities. And care, infrastructure writ large demands that we imagine what we want our future society to look like, whether that's the roads that we drive on, the buildings that we work in, or what jobs are available. And the care economy is going to play a big role in that. It's one of the fastest growing industries. By 2050, the number of individuals in need of long-term care services will likely double from 13 million in the year 2000 to over 27 million people. And we need safe, well-paying jobs that pay a living wage to meet that demand, to ensure that our loved ones are cared for. And the administration's investment in the care economy will have a big impact on an often overlooked workforce. 1 in 6 care workers live below the poverty line. And this is a workforce that is over 90% women, more than half are women of color, and 31% are immigrants. And the care provisions in this plan would finally cement long overdue protections for this essential workforce, including awarding care workers the ability to raise wages and gain stronger benefits through collective bargaining. And valuing and respecting this labor is the beginning of what we must do to address the long history of racial exclusion and that this workforce has faced for decades. And so all in all, I think that what we're seeing the administration take a step forward in undoing unjust racial and gender inequities, while also solidifying a strong care economy for the future. And where they can and should go bigger and bolder is how we pay for something like this, right? The infrastructure package will be paid for in large part by increasing taxes on corporations. But as we know, corporations love to dodge taxes. And so the Biden administration announced that it would increase increase the corporate tax rate from 25 to 28%, but that's, still lower than the 35% that it was before President Trump came into office. And 28% of zero is still zero. So Congress and the administration need to take bold action on our tax code to ensure that corporations and wealthy individuals pay their fair share. And this is something the inequality team is actively working on. We found that the increase in billionaire wealth during the pandemic alone could pay for 70% of the American jobs plan. And so, in summary, I guess, the administration is moving in the right direction, but I think it's important that the administration reminds itself that we can tax the rich, we can fund our communities, and we can build an equitable America in the process.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. As you all know, here at IPS, we do go deep on how to pay for things, how to responsibly or fairly tax individuals, corporations, and Wall Street. So feel free in that Q&A box to talk about that or anything else. One other thing that's just a theme here that will come up, I'm sure, in the conversation is IPS has proudly worked with the groups that put together the big CARE campaign in this country, anchored in the National Domestic Workers Alliance and Jobs with Justice, the coalition caring across generations. And there may be an interesting correlation between the boldness of where Biden has gone in areas where he's been bold, as Karen and Rebecca have pointed out, and the strength of social movements that have been pushing for change. This is one of our hypotheses at IPS. So let me turn next to Basav Sen. Giant part of this conversation has been around climate. We're proud to have Basav heading up our climate policy work at IPS. Basav Sen.
Thank you, John. On the front of addressing the climate crisis, where the Biden administration stands is light years ahead of prior administrations and light years behind where they need to be in 2021. And that's essentially because of the low bar, the low starting point, because prior administrations, including the Obama administration, was so terrible on the issue of climate. And also because scientific knowledge has shifted and climate change impacts are upon us much sooner than people had expected, let's say 10 years ago. Here are a few things that the Biden administration is getting right. Number one, they recognize that addressing the climate crisis requires massive government investment and regulation, and that it's not enough to tinker around the edges with a carbon market or a carbon tax or some other so-called market-based solution. And number two, they are refusing to subscribe to the false narrative of jobs versus the environment and instead recognize climate action as a huge opportunity to create lots of good jobs. And number three, the centrality of environmental justice, at least on paper, in the Biden administration's climate plans, where instead of siloing it into a tiny office in the EPA, they are incorporating the need to address systemic inequities in exposure to pollution based on race and class into the entirety of the administration's climate plans. But here's where they are falling short. Number one, they are largely ignoring the elephant in the room, which is fossil fuels. The United States is now the world's largest producer of both oil and gas and a large exporter. And there is no way we can address the climate crisis while ignoring our role in perpetuating it by producing the stuff that's causing it in the first place. And yes, getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies is a big step forward, but that's only a small part of the picture. And we need to have an intentional plan to phase out production with a just transition for workers and communities who are dependent on these industries for their livelihood. And this gets to my second point. As a means of perpetuating fossil fuels, they are falling for the worst false solutions, things like carbon capture and storage, which are called unicorns in the world of climate justice because they quite simply don't exist. And to gamble a future on infeasible, hugely expensive technologies is a gamble we cannot afford. And besides, they also perpetuate environmental injustice. And all of this is only at the domestic level. If you go to the international level, which I will not touch upon right now, there's a lot more that's missing on the Biden administration's climate plans.
Thanks so much, Basa. Great. And we're going to have one more contribution from our panel here, and then we'll open it up into a conversation. Thank you. 3 of you have already raised questions. Please do it if you could in the Q&A box. We've got some right now in the chat room, so we should have time to get to all of them. Finally, we're going to turn to Ashik Sadiq, who is one of the gems at IPS that we brought in 3 years ago, is the National Priorities Project, a wonderful institution that has existed for over 3 decades. And Ashik is a research analyst for the National Priorities Project, has done really innovative works around what he calls and they call the militarization budget, the part of the budget that is the militarization budget. So Ashik, how do you see these 100 days?
Yeah, so thanks everybody for laying out the domestic context from all my fellow gems at IPS. So I'm going to show you a few charts that lay out how the budget has changed, at least the budget requests since the Trump administration into these first 100 days of the Biden administration. So just to frame all of this, this was Trump's last budget request for the discretionary budget, which is the budget that Congress allocates every year. Over half of it was proposed to go to the military, and this is not what ultimately passed Congress, but Trump's priorities domestically were just all about militarizing every aspect really of domestic and foreign policy while cutting needs for all forms of social spending. So this is a significant change where the Biden administration has, for the first time in many years, shifted the balance of the discretionary budget from non-military to military spending. This is the first time in many years that military makes up less than 50% of the discretionary budget. So that is a really significant change. It obviously reflects how dire economic conditions have been in the past year and how much that's shifted the entire political landscape. But it also reflects how many different movements have come together to organize for years and decades to shift needs. And at this moment, it's been effective. So the administration has touted the changes that have increased pretty much every sector of the domestic budget. And you can see in this chart here, the percent change by sector is lowest for Homeland Security and military, which, if you look at it that way, that's a good thing that these are the least. However, they still are increasing. And for many years, many of our movement partners at IPS have been advocating to cut spending on military and Homeland Security because these are militarized parts of the budget that are actually causing harm, not meaningfully providing the kinds of security that are being touted. And you can see here in total dollar amounts, military actually has the 3rd largest increase of any department. And if you compare that to a lot of the things that we just heard about from some of my colleagues, if you compare the proposed military budget for next year to the American Jobs Plan, it really pales in comparison. And as Basov said, much more spending is needed on climate infrastructure in particular. So this is a real imbalance in proposed spending. And even if you look at the amount that the Pentagon budget is proposed to increase, 12.3 billion, that's more than the entire budget for the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And this is in a year where obviously public health has been revealed as extremely underfunded. So there are some serious imbalances here where the military budget is something that at IPS we've been calling to basically cut in half for years, but this is actually increasing it. And I'll just sum it up by saying what really needs to change is reevaluating where all that money goes in general. New data just came out this past week about global military spending, and the US now spends more than the next 11 countries combined and more than over 140 countries of the world combined. This is the highest military spending at any point since World War II, except for a few years during the first decade of the War on Terror. And the reasons that are being proposed for these increases, which our international policy experts will get into, are just really, don't meet any kind of scrutiny. The U.S. is now overextended all over the world in its global military footprint. In some ways hasn't fundamentally changed since the end of World War II, and it's since expanded to many more parts of the world. So we really need a fundamental reevaluation of our national priorities away from military toward domestic needs.
Thanks so much, all four of you, but thank you, Ashik, on that. We have over 20 minutes now for a conversation on the domestic policy side before we turn to foreign policy, some of which Ashik just hinted at. Let me start with a question from Tunde Osazua. He said, how can Biden claim to be addressing racial and gender inequalities when the racial wealth gap increases every year and is projected to continue to increase even with this new bill? And so that's a very specific question. I'd love any of you who would like to comment on that also in the larger sense of how you think Biden is doing around addressing systemic racism in this country. It's interesting, he is one of the first presidents to use that word consistently, but is it, from your view, mainly talk and not enough action? And if any of you would like to address the actual specifics of that question. Karen, your project is called The Criminalization of Race and Poverty. Do you want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's obviously a really good point, and this is going to be a very hard and long process to make serious dents in that. As John said, Biden has made it a cornerstone, a pillar of all of his proposals, from the American Rescue Plan to the American Families Plan to the American Jobs Plan and the appropriations process, and at every department level across the board. So all of the investments that he is proposing are targeted specifically toward BIPOC communities, especially Black, Brown, Native, and Native communities. Everything from job creation to HBCUs to essential workers to the caring economy. All of this is through a lens of funneling the most home ownership. He's investing a lot in home ownership for Black and Brown communities. So this is something we haven't seen before. So we don't yet know the impact it will have on the racial wealth gap. But because he is going after taxing the wealthy, he's going after progressive policies with a particular focus on making sure that the most money goes to Black, Brown, and Native communities and impoverished communities, that we have a better outlook than in past administrations. And he hasn't yet gotten to his criminal justice reform. So that's next on his agenda. I don't have as much faith that he will go as deep in criminal justice reform as he has on some of the domestic policy issues. But his Justice Department is now getting involved in some of the police killings, which of course wouldn't have happened under Trump. There's a lot more to be done, but he's starting off with the right focus, but he's got to be pushed. He won't do anything without social movements. So we've got to continue to push.
Yeah, Rebecca, do you want to say anything about the racial and gender? You began to hint at this, but implications of the proposals you described around the care economy?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's notable that, there is this targeted, approach towards the care economy, which I mentioned before, is overwhelmingly women of color and primarily, immigrant women. And I think it's important to note that, these issues don't exist in a silo. The care economy is not really its own thing without action being taken on things like immigration, for example. So I think that's definitely top of mind. And with things like the racial wealth gap, I will just add there definitely is a ton more that the administration can take on to address that. The inequality team put together together a snappy report with 10 solutions to bridge the racial wealth gap, ranging with things like baby bonds, Medicare for all, of course, postal banking, Congressional Committee on Reparations. So I'm happy to link that report in the chat as well. So yeah, that's definitely not to say that, everything is perfect right now. There definitely is a ton more that we can do to push the administration to adequately address the racial and gender wealth gap. And again, like how Karen said, it's really up to us to be plugged in with the social movements to really push the administration on this.
Yeah, I wonder, Basab, you talked about both where you thought Biden was being bold and where he needs to go much further. He likes to talk about the impact of climate and environmental policy on communities of color and equity. How do you think he's actually doing on that? And how would these proposals impact it?
Unfortunately, he has compromised even from his own initial proposal. And this sounds extremely wonky and technical, but it's worth going into. Where his initial plan called for 40% of investments in climate action going to impacted frontline communities. And that has changed to 40% of the benefits should go to impacted frontline communities. Now, the problem with this change formulation is that the funding can go to some corporation that's claiming to create jobs in a frontline community. And that's clearly insufficient because we need funding to actually go to communities to create their own community-owned solutions. For example, community-owned distributed renewable energy, as against corporate-controlled renewable energy, where some members of frontline communities can get a few of the lowest paid positions, which is crumbs, and that's not what movements have been demanding. And that's really getting into the weeds on one little thing, but I think it's emblematic of the very problematic compromises that the administration has made.
Thank you, Bas. I have a couple of questions to you, Ashik, have come up that are related to issues around systemic racism. One, just a very practical one. People love the comparisons you all do at the National Priorities Project at IPS, the trade-offs and all. Andy Shalal was asking, what is the budget of the CDC? I think he wanted to look at it vis-a-vis what you just pointed out will be the increase in military spending. So if you could say something about that. And then secondly, one of the questions in the Q&A box is the police are highly militarized, especially in Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities in the United States. Programs like the 1033 program still exist. Why is this, and is there any sense that the Biden administration is taking action on this?
Yeah, those are really good questions. Regarding the CDC, I can drop a link to analyses we've done over the past year, just comparing how much the US government has funded the CDC versus all the forms of military spending that just make it pale in comparison. The chart I briefly breezed through in my intro was that the CDC for next year is budgeted a little over $8 billion, 8.7 billion, which is less than the entire proposed increase to the military budget. So the Biden administration has been touting the CDC increase as the biggest increase to the CDC in many years, which is true. But like Basab was saying for climate, it's been a pretty low bar for a long time. And the question about systemic racism and policing, the 1033 program is something that we talk a lot about as just a direct way that the military budget, how Pentagon spending is funneled back into domestic communities in the US. So like weapons of war, like tanks and grenades are provided to police departments, which contributes to the extreme militarism that we've seen on the streets, where plenty of streets and cities across the country look like war zones in response to protests against horrible racial injustice. So the 1033 program is something where I think, this is an area where Biden has not lived up to his promises. He had promised to at least go back to the commitment that Obama had made to undo the 1033 program, which then Trump came into office and undid that undoing. And even that Obama era executive order on 1033, as Lindsay is saying in the chat, was not adequate. And Biden has not yet followed through on his intention to reissue that order. So there are a number of legislative proposals to end that program altogether. Well, we need, this is a specific thing that a lot of the movements that have been empowered in the past few years can keep pressing. And I'll just add another part of the militarized budget, the domestic militarized budget, that beyond just the military spending is in Homeland Security and immigration enforcement. And this is where the Biden administration has not significantly cut the budgets to ICE and CBP, Border Patrol. And there's a lot that they could do to reinvest in actually, providing for the infrastructure to absorb more refugees, which the US is extremely capable of doing. Trump has cut refugees to the lowest numbers in many years. So we have yet to see commitments to that. But what we do see in this budget is that there are new investments proposed within ICE and CBP for things like diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings for ICE officers, which we've already seen. Folks have been pointing out that these things have failed in police departments. You can't just train police to be less racist when structurally they're charged with enforcing racial inequality in many ways. So the border budgeting is a lot like that.
Thanks, Ashik. You've raised some issues, each of you just did, about movements. And I wonder if each of you could comment on this for a moment. I think many of us in the progressive community, including at IPS, are self-critical of what we did in the first 2 years of Obama. Obama's elected, promising all sorts of big things. A lot of people stayed at home, got off the streets, and waited for great things to happen. And a lot of the buildup to Biden being elected and then being inaugurated, the progressive community said we can't make that same mistake again. So I'm curious in each of your sense, because this gives us, I think, some clues into what movements can and should be doing in the future. Where you think, or give an example of where you think a movement has done something particularly effective in putting pressure on Biden that is seen in something that's happened in these 100 days, and potentially, and or also as you look ahead to the next 100 days and the rest of this year, where you think that activism will be and should be focused. I mean, Ashik, you just alluded to this around ICE and CBP. What are the plans of movements to try to increase pressure there that could lead to action? But going back to you, Karen, and any thoughts on this? You alluded to this in some of your comments, but I wonder if there's like an area where you felt, yay, this was effective.
Yeah, thank you, John. Well, since the issues I'm talking about are primarily social safety net issues around housing and healthcare and food and education and childcare and child poverty, a lot of the policies that Biden has proposed and some that have been passed do come straight from the human needs community. They have been very receptive to listening to the needs and the price tags that many advocates and impacted people have put on some of these, although I articulated where they're falling short. Those are just some of the places where they're falling short. But I also would like to point people to the Poor People's Campaign. So we at the Institute for Policy Studies, we work with the Poor People's Campaign quite closely, and we help them develop something called the moral budget. And if you look on our website, ips-dc.org, you'll be able to find the moral budget, and you can see that a lot of the things that we called for around these social safety net issues and funding human needs are being addressed, some in even more deeply than what we asked for, and some that of course fall short. So I would point people primarily to the Poor People's Campaign, and then the Coalition on Human Needs is another organization that kind of brings together a lot of single issue focused groups like housing groups and food assistance groups. And you can get a lot of access into social movements that way. And as I said, without social movements, he wouldn't be doing anything. So anything that we want done more, we have to put pressure on ourselves.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. Rebecca, anything you'd want to add? As I was listening to you, I was also thinking some of the terms you were using, Rebecca, like care economy and care infrastructure, did not exist 15 years ago. So I'm kind of curious what role you feel movements have played and any lessons from what you've watched movements do in this space.
Yeah, definitely. I think a lot of movements can learn a lot from, groups like the National Domestic Workers Alliance and sort of how successful they've been in getting their issues to the administration and really at the forefront of the administration. And I think going forward, we're really seeing sort of care advocates, like I mentioned before, really link arms with other movement areas. I mean, this is why we're seeing, a lot of care organizations link arms with immigrant rights organizations, racial justice organizations, labor unions. And I think it's really important that that kind of synergy is needed to enact real change. And on the, the tax policy side of things, I think our partners are welcoming this, slight increase in the corporate tax rate and the doubling of the capital gains tax on the wealthiest Americans. But I think they're also, asking the administration to be bigger and bolder about really taxing the rich, thinking about a wealth tax, thinking about an estate tax. All of that should be on the table if you really want the wealthy, the wealthiest individuals to start paying their fair share, especially considering the enormous gains to wealth that individuals have received during the pandemic.
Great. Yeah, Basav, anything you'd like to add on this?
Yes, the areas where I mentioned the Biden administration appears to be getting things right, I would attribute pretty much 100% to decades of grassroots pressure, decades of organizing by the most affected people, by environmental justice communities, and so on. They wouldn't have made any of these concessions but for these struggles. But as I also pointed out, there's a long way to go, and I will point to just some ongoing struggles right now. There's a massive struggle around a tar sands pipeline in Minnesota called Line 3, where indigenous water protectors are putting their bodies on the line, trying to stop this polluting pipeline project that the Biden administration could shut down just like that if they wanted to. And the fact that this is still ongoing shows just how much power the fossil fuel industry has and how much the administration is willing to concede to them. And similarly, there's an ongoing fight around a very polluting plastics and petrochemical facilities in Cancer Alley in Louisiana called Formosa Plastic. And the fact that sitting here in 2021 with a straight face, we can refer to a place as Cancer Alley shows that there's something deeply wrong with structural environmental racism in this country. The fact that we can treat a population predominantly Black and poor as a sacrifice zone. And that just shows the depth of the problems we are trying to address here.
Thanks so much, Basav. You actually answered 3 of the questions that have come up around specific fights like Dakota Access Pipeline, the Enbridge line. There's also the fight Karen talked about, the Poor People's Campaign. They're focused on a fight against a big copper mine in Arizona that is on sacred Apache land. And so thank you for lifting those up. By the way, there's a lot of questions around US foreign policy. So for those of you who've joined late, in about 5 minutes, we're going to shift over to foreign policy, and I will read those questions when we've heard from those presenters. But I'm curious, Ashik, if there's anything else you would like to say around the issue of social movements.
Yeah, I think I won't say much about military policy since Phyllis and Carrie and John will probably say more in the next section. But one of the clearest indications we've seen that movements are pressuring the administration right now is on immigration and the number of refugees. that the administration has initially proposed to accept and then has backtracked on. So just like the context for all this is, like as many of you know, we're currently in the biggest refugee crisis globally since World War II, pretty much. As folks, including David Vine, who I see in the chat, have written, there's at least 37 million people have been displaced in recent years, which is like the entire population of the state of California. And in that context, Trump has been, year by year, cutting the number of refugees that were accepted to the U.S. until this year it's at a record low, I think something like 10 or 15,000. So Biden had campaigned on raising that to over 120,000, which would be the highest refugee cap, I think, since the Clinton administration. And that's even lower than what it's been in the past. Like under Reagan, I think it was over 200,000 per year. So in the past few weeks, the Biden administration had been waffling on that commitment, saying that they would keep the Trump cap for this year, and then immigrant rights groups were furious and pushed back. So now they've said that they might raise it again, and now it's very much a live issue. And I think plenty of Senate Democrats are now pressuring the Biden administration. So the fact that there is this waffling, and they weren't just sticking with the commitment to keep the numbers low, which they could have if there hadn't been pressure. Like this is going back and forth, and it seems very possible that they could raise it by the end of the summer. Just speaks to how powerful immigrant rights groups have been organizing.
Thanks, Ashik. Maybe just one final question here before shifting to foreign policy. It's a kind of transition to foreign policy question, as you were just getting into with refugees. Someone has asked about the fact that deportations have continued under Biden, singling out in particular Haitian immigrants into this country. Do any of you want to say anything? We'll get back in again into, I think, the refugee question with Korea and others in the second half, but anything you want to say about immigration policy or about these deportations and what you've seen in these first 100 days? I don't know, Ashik or Rebecca or any of you, if you want to comment on that, how he's doing. There's been a lot of criticism from both left and right on these issues.
Yeah, I can just briefly say that obviously it's very disheartening to see the number of not just deportations but expulsions of particularly Black immigrants from Haiti. And we're talking about children as well, not just adults, but actual families back to Haiti. And it's very disheartening to see, the administration has not taken any action on that, and has sort of been moving fairly slowly as it relates to immigration. I mean, the new ICE head was just appointed yesterday. So, I think that's sort of an issue area where movements are going to be, I can foresee movements pressuring the administration to take a lot of action on that. And there is a lot to be done, with ICE and CBP budgets, like Ashik was mentioning. And yeah, but I will just say that it is obviously very disheartening to see the number of, in particular, just expulsions and deportations against Black immigrants in particular from Haiti, from Cameroon. And yeah, that's definitely something where I foresee a lot of movement work being done in the months to come.
Thanks so much. And thanks to all of you. Don't go anywhere, Karen, Rebecca, Basav, and Ashik, because we're shifting now to the foreign policy, international policy portion of this, where there are quite a few questions already up there. The tone of this conversation, I think, may be about to shift a bit, because it's a fascinating question how you could have the sort of enthusiasm that Karen expressed around some specific domestic policy issues, social safety net issues, even though with big caveats that you added there, Karen, but to shift into foreign policy where I think almost overwhelmingly, I'll just speak for IPS, our conversations have been incredibly critical of what this administration has done. I know we came into the Biden administration afraid that there would be a new Cold War, that they would, as Trump had, pursue a new Cold War with China. And also with Russia. And so this is a great moment to step back and see how that's going. A lot of the questions have to do with also Biden policy in Africa, with AFRICOM and other parts of the world. So we'll get into that. But we have three great people here. As I mentioned before, John Pfeffer from our Foreign Policy and Focus program, Phyllis Bennis from our New Internationalism program, and Corrie Peterson-Smith our Michael Ratner Middle East Fellow. So again, we're going to do what we did before. We're going to give them each 3 to 3.5 minutes here to lay out a few things on, and we've asked them each to go a little deeper in their comments because the world is vast. So you'll just get a little, this is like an appetizer, and then we'll get into your questions that will go broader in the conversation. So starting with you, John Pfeffer, author of the great new book, The Pandemic Pivot, based on conversations with experts all over the world, both researchers and activists, and a great global agenda put forward in this book. John.
Thank you, John. And you know, you mentioned the lack of enthusiasm, and that I think is generally true. But of course, in the first couple of days, we were enthusiastic about the Biden administration reversing some of the worst acts of the Trump administration, rejoining the World Health Organization, rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement. And that was an indication that the Biden administration, well, was committing to a form of multilateralism, of working with other countries to solve global problems. But of course, there's another form of multilateralism, and that is joining with our allies, US allies, and others to contain great powers. In other words, working with NATO and European countries to contain Russia, and working with South Korea and Japan, as well as the Quad, India and Australia included, to contain China. And you know, this is part of a longer term transformation, one could argue, that a number of administrations have attempted to steer US policy, foreign policy, away from the war on terror, so-called, and toward great power competition. And something attempted by the Obama administration, something the Trump administration talked about, something that looks like the Biden administration is pursuing more deliberately. Obviously, we've seen an escalation in tensions with Russia, certainly over Ukraine, around cyber operations, the Arctic, human rights. We've seen a continuation of tensions with China around trade issues, human rights, Hong Kong, South China Sea. We're seeing an ongoing global posture review, that is a review of global military posture of the United States, which I suspect will demonstrate very concretely a shift of resources away from more or less the Middle East and towards the containment of Russia and China. Okay, that's the bad news, the glass half empty, if you will. Glass half full, a couple of good things we've seen. Of course, the Biden administration extended New START. That's the single most important, or actually the last strategic arms control treaty with Russia. And we saw recently a climate summit, and Russia and China played an important role there. So obviously, there are still communication channels open with Moscow and with Beijing. If I was to say two things that we could focus on in terms of moving forward, one is, you know, there are some simple things, not so simple perhaps, but at least on paper simple things we could do with Russia. For instance, under START, we have a ceiling of about 1,500 for strategic nuclear weapons. We could actually reduce that to 1,000 in a mutual agreement that doesn't require a treaty. That would be a memorandum of understanding that would reduce strategic nuclear weapons, long range, by 1/3. So that's something that the Biden administration could do. And then finally, a cyber truce. Obviously, there's been a lot in the news about operations by Russia and China in the United States, less about US operations in other countries. But the Biden administration could sit down with Putin and with Xi and negotiate a cyber truce. This is not unheard of. The Obama administration negotiated one with China that led to a 90% reduction in cyber attacks coming from China on the United States. And Putin himself has on several occasions offered or recommended some kind of a truce in cyber realm. So I'll leave it there just on those two recommendations, but there are plenty more that could come up in Q&A.
Thanks so much. Okay, turning next to Phyllis Bennis. Phyllis, you've been an outspoken spokesperson of the peace movement for 20 years about the US war in Afghanistan. Is it over? I mean, are you ready to give him an A+ on that one?
Oh, no, not even close, not surprisingly. Now, let's just start with, it's great that Biden said that he's pulling the troops out of Afghanistan. That was, of course, the first war of the broader global war on terror. Biden is right when he says it's time to end America's longest war in Afghanistan. He should have said that years, a long time ago, but okay. But there's at least two big problems that we face in trying to look at what he's really talking about. First, so far Biden is basically talking about withdrawing, quote, the troops. He seems to be referring to the 2,500 or so regular combat troops, training troops that are now in Afghanistan. But besides that 2,500 contingent, there's at least 1,000 special operations forces running around Afghanistan, mainly in assassination efforts and some others that are not being mentioned. We don't even know how many CIA and other secret agents, that paramilitary agents, are doing the same thing. And we do know that there's about 18,000 mercenaries, private military contractors, they like to call themselves, who are basically working with and for the Afghan military, but many of them, most of them, are paid by the Pentagon. So we don't know what's supposed to happen to all those other military forces when that small group of ground troops are pulled out. Are they all going to leave too, or are some of them going to stay behind? Some clever manipulation that will let them continue fighting and training the Afghan military, for instance, claiming that they're suddenly under the command of an expanded US embassy or something like that, instead of being an acknowledged military force. So that's a big question. Which troops, how many troops are we actually leaving behind? The second big problem is that almost all of the civilian casualties in Afghanistan caused by the United States, and that's a lot, are caused not by those ground troops and those training troops, but are caused by US forces that are pilots, that are dropping bombs, that are running the drones, and that they are killing not only so-called terrorists, another whole problem of how this war is being waged, but they're too often attacking and killing people in wedding parties, in funeral processions, children that are playing in their own villages. And so far, nobody officially is talking in the administration about ending the air war. They call it the anti-terrorism component, and that's supposed to be separate. The problem is it's still Afghans that are being killed by US forces. And without ending that, without ending the air war, Washington's forever war in Afghanistan continues. So Biden's able to ultimately withdraw some of the troops, at least the ground troops, mostly because politically that's become possible, because a majority of people in this country now want to end the war. And it's been our movements, the anti-war movements, the anti-imperialist movements, the solidarity movements around the country that have played a huge role in that transition of public opinion. You know, the first mobilization against the war in Afghanistan happened on the day the war began, October 7th, 2001, just 3 weeks after the 9/11 attacks. The planning for it had started literally the day after 9/11, when people realized this was going to mean the US going to war. And that demonstration was held at a time when the US public opinion was 80% in favor of the war. Now, 20 years later, 76% of people say pull out all the troops. And the reason that didn't just happen, it happened because of all the work we did in mobilizations and education to change that public opinion. And that's been huge. Now, that's obviously not enough. It's not just because of the change in public opinion, but we need to continue that mobilization. We need to continue that education work. We have to work towards really ending the US war in Afghanistan, all of it, the air war and the drone war, the secret so-called anti-terrorism war, as well as the ground war that we're hearing more about. And we have to figure out how to provide to the people of Afghanistan what we owe. Now, we don't owe a continued military occupation. We don't owe military assault. We don't owe impunity at the International Criminal Court for the allegations of US torture in Afghanistan, US war crimes that are now being investigated in The Hague by the International Court. But we do owe reparations and compensation. And we have to figure out how to make real that obligation. Now, there are answers, of course, to the claims of why we can't pull out, why the war has to continue, that it's disrespectful to those US soldiers who have been killed there, that we're abandoning our allies, that the Afghan military won't be strong enough, and crucially, the question about human rights and specifically women's rights. I'll touch on that one for a minute. I won't get into the others for lack of time, but in the Q&A, we certainly can come back to some answers for those other claims. But the question about women is an important one. It played a big role in justifying this war in very false ways. Now, it's true that under US occupation and imposed by the United States, certain rights for women in the two big cities of Kabul and Kandahar were enforced in a way that they had not been. It did not take into account the realities of Afghan culture and Afghan history, but certain gains were made by women in the urban areas. And there may be some slippage of those. We don't know for sure, but it's likely. However, between 75 and 80% of the people of Afghanistan don't live in the cities. They live in tiny, isolated villages. And the women in those villages have gained almost nothing through these, other than war and the death of family members, in this 2-decade-long war that the United States has waged in their country. So one of the things that we're looking at is the fact that after 20 years of US military occupation and US war, the women of Afghanistan still face the highest level of infant mortality in the whole world. We haven't provided that for women. So this has not been something waged for women, and we have to get past that. Finally, let me just say something that Obama's top Afghan commander, General Stanley McChrystal, said back in 2009 and 10 when he was in command there. He said US forces and US-led forces had, quote, shot an amazing number of people, but to my knowledge, none has ever proved to be a threat. He then went on to say, we are going to lose this effing war if we don't stop killing civilians. That was 10 years ago. In 2019, 9 years later, the UN reported that the US and its allies were responsible for more civilian deaths than the Taliban were. That's after 10 years after the US commander said, we have to stop killing civilians or we're gonna lose. It's like, hello, you've lost this war. And almost all of those deaths and injuries were from US airstrikes, not the 2,500 troops that they're now talking about pulling out. We cannot take any of this for granted. We need to keep fighting for a real end to this so-called forever war. That means ending US military intervention and engagement in Afghanistan, repealing the authorization by Congress that made this war, the global war on terror, possible in the first place. And we need a much clearer commitment to diplomacy over war. That's on us. That's about what our movements are going to fight for. The Biden administration is not about ending this war. This is what we're going to have to continue to fight for.
Thanks so much, Phyllis, for your incredible clarity on that. And we turn finally to Currie Peterson-Smith, who is Phyllis's close colleague in the New Internationalism work at IPS and is our Michael Ratner Middle East Fellow at IPS. Currie.
Hi, such a pleasure to be here. And even though we're talking about some difficult things, I think in this section, I'm so heartened to see so many internationalists and anti-militarists here in the chat as participants. And that's important because we really have our work cut out for us in these coming years. So, as Phyllis kind of zoomed in on Afghanistan, I want to say a word about US policy toward Yemen in particular, and note that in the first days of, really just days into the administration, Biden announced that there would be a freeze on weapons sales to Saudi Arabia and to the United Arab Emirates. In particular, in the last days of the Trump administration, Trump negotiated a $23 billion weapons deal to the UAE as part of its joining this normalization agreement with Israel. And so the Biden administration pressed pause on that. And that was a very significant thing. If there's one thing that the US is extremely effective at, is kind of a well-oiled machine, it's selling weapons to other countries. And while there's a number of steps, possible steps in that process where the government can press pause, it usually doesn't. The fact that Biden did was very significant and got a lot of us to pay attention. Weeks later, Biden announced that the US would end its support for Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen, which is, again, also very significant. Now, it's important to say a couple of things about that announcement and about actually that war. This refers to the war that Saudi Arabia, along with the United Arab Emirates, started in 2015, where those forces essentially weighed in on behalf of the forces they backed in Yemen's civil war. And this war, again, led by Saudi Arabia and the UAE, has really been an American war in every sense. It has been fought with US weapons, with US intelligence. There's been an operation in which US aircraft actually refuel Saudi aircraft mid-air. The US has provided the targets for these airstrikes. In many cases, the US was doing everything except dropping the bombs itself, which were US bombs. And it's also important to say that that war has been catastrophic. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and their partners have killed tens of thousands of people, have displaced some 2.5 million people in Yemen. Hunger, really mass starvation, and a number of disease outbreaks, including COVID, but before that, cholera, and in an ongoing way, cholera actually have really devastated the country. And again, this is a US war. In so many ways. It's also important to note there's not enough conversation about the fact that the US has also carries out its own separate operations in Yemen that predate actually the 2015 Saudi UAE invasion. The US has been doing that since 2002. So the US is in many ways implicated in the violence in Yemen. Now, when Biden made this announcement that the US would no longer be part of the kind of Saudi UAE war, that was very significant, a big deal, and in many ways a victory that was really the pressure of movements, particularly movements here in the US, led by Yemeni and Yemeni American folks. And it's been a combination of movement activity, humanitarian organizations, and then advocacy organizations really pushing, and that pushing heated up under the Trump administration, and really this announcement is an indication of a real success. Now, it was this kind of success in terms of an announcement or in terms of rhetoric, but since then it's become clear that the Biden administration is actually not doing anything meaningful to end the war. Beyond that kind of announcement, there's been nothing significant to actually end the war. So Saudi Arabia continues bombing Yemen and continues doing so with US weapons. Biden actually moved forward with the weapons sale to Saudi Arabia and to the UAE. It should be said that one of the points that Biden made when talking about ending US support for the war is that the US would support Saudi Arabia in terms of self-defense. And of course, there's all kinds of things that are justified in the name of self-defense. The US military is run through the Department of Defense, which we know is a misnomer in so many ways. And so the weapons, the basis for selling, for doing things like weapon sales is justified in terms of Saudi Arabia defending itself, which is just absolutely false when we look at what Saudi Arabia is actually doing in its relationship with Yemen. So it's also the case that Saudi Arabia is maintaining this crushing blockade on Yemen. Yemen has a tremendous dependence on imports and humanitarian aid, and this blockade has really been quite devastating. And the US, again, could do a lot to end that blockade. It's choosing that too. And with that, I actually want to shout out an action taking place right now by the Yemeni Liberation Movement, which is having this hunger strike in Washington, D.C. at the White House to call attention to the blockade and to the US's role in it. And so I hope that everybody supports that activity. With that, I just want to pivot and say a word about the question of the border and immigration, which has also come up in the chat in this discussion, and of course came up in the first part of the discussion. And I thank my colleagues Rebecca and Nashik for speaking to this as well. And so, again, there has been a shift rhetorically, that's quite significant. Whereas Trump openly, enthusiastically, we all remember the references, with great cruelty, demonized immigrants and migrants of all kinds in very openly, nakedly racist ways. Biden talks about the question of immigration in humanitarian terms. Rhetorically acknowledges the human rights of people who are seeking lives and entry into this country. But again, the reality has been a lot more consistency really than departure. And so we continue to see family separation at the border as children are allowed into the country on a certain basis, but adults are not, which means that families, of course, are separated. We've seen the reopening of Trump-era child detention facilities. We've seen the activation of military bases meant to hold detained immigrants and so on. And again, as my colleagues pointed out, we've seen deportations, in particular, of Black immigrants to places like Haiti and Cameroon. I'll also add Southeast Asian immigrants to places like Vietnam. So that has to change, and I'll wrap up by saying that when the family separation policy was rolled out under the Trump administration, there was really an outpouring of protest and outrage and sympathy and solidarity across this country under the banner "Keep Families Together," and that really was quite impactful. And we're going to have to continue to build and sustain that kind of resistance that, again, centers the humanity of these people who are just migrating, which of course is a human right. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Curry. You can see why I feel so privileged to work here at IPS. What I'm going to do, since there's so many questions on foreign policy, and there's several on the Middle East, some on Latin America, some on Africa, is I'm just going to read them. And then if we could go to each of you, and if you could each answer one of them. One also deals with you, Basav. You already alluded to both the domestic and international parts of the climate policy. So let me just read these. One, this is from an anonymous attendee. Biden has decided not to reverse Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and the US Embassy will not be moved back to Tel Aviv. How can he take this stance yet claim to support, quote, democracy around the world? From a John F., not our John F. Here's a question. The Biden administration is widely expected to nominate a larger portion of career diplomats for US ambassadorships. How significant is that for bilateral diplomacy when whether the Biden administration nominates a political or career diplomat for ambassador posts? I know all of you are lauding the shift from a foreign policy based on war to one based on diplomacy, or you're pushing that. So that is relevant there. One from Kenan, has anyone mentioned that Biden bombed Somalia in the first 24 hours? One on Africa gets into something that IPS has been critiquing really since its beginning, AFRICOM, the US military command in Africa. Do any of you see prospects of that ending or being cut back? It's related to an issue that, Curry, you dive deep into in your work, that David Vine in the chat has raised, which is, do you all see any prospects of cutting military bases, and what would it take in Africa or elsewhere? And final two, I mean, this is really interesting in terms of, I think, people's hopes. One of the attendees asked the question about sanctions, US sanctions against Cuba and Venezuela, and whether any of you see any prospects of those ending, or of movements pushing for those to be ended. Any hints from the Biden administration on that? And finally, Basav, there was a question about US global climate policy, which is how can Biden claim to be a climate president if he is pursuing imperialistic actions overseas? This person mentioned Latin America, with US extractive companies and others going into those parts of the world. So that's just a little bit, fewer questions around China and Russia, John, where you started. But why don't we just go through to each of you? We've got about 15 minutes for this conversation. But there still are other questions. So why don't you each take a couple of minutes, though, starting with you, John Pfeffer.
Thanks, John. Did you want us to respond to one question, or
one, or if you can do two in 2 minutes, go for it. If you have a short answer on any one of them, that's fine.
Well, on the career versus political appointees in the State Department, I mean, obviously, it's useful to have people in there who have experience doing the actual diplomacy over the years. But of course, there are some people who, are not necessarily good diplomats and have been not so committed to diplomacy. So I prefer to look at people on a case-by-case basis rather than say, I'd rather have career diplomats versus political appointees. On the question of bases, and I'll just, that'll be my second question I'll address. I mean, the global posture review will probably come down on a reapportionment of resources in terms of global basing. And so we'll probably see a reduction of US bases, probably in terms of numbers. It may not mean a reduction in actual resources that go to military bases, but I think in general, the United States is trying to move away from fixed positions and towards a more flexible approach, which is not necessarily, in general, necessarily something we would support, but I think we will see a reduction, for instance, of bases in Afghanistan itself, whether those bases move to Central Asia, like Kyrgyzstan, or to Pakistan. Neither country is enthusiastic about having those bases, or they'll be eliminated altogether. And then, the drone strikes and the airstrikes that Phyllis was talking about will simply be conducted by aircraft, from aircraft carriers or from long-range bases. And so the net effect will not be a reduction in violence, even though you'll see a reduction in the actual bases. So I'd rather look at kind of the overall kind of calculus of violence rather than the actual footprint. How much violence is the US actually conducting in the world from its global posture?
Thanks so much. Yeah, Phyllis.
Well, thanks all. These are fascinating questions. I'll jump on two of them, I think, on Jerusalem and more broadly, because Korea and I do spend a lot of our project's time on Palestinian rights and the Palestinian rights movement. I think that the easy answer to how can Biden claim to support democracy around the world and yet say that he's not going to change Trump's horrific move of the US embassy to Jerusalem, and in fact recognize Jerusalem as the capital, the undivided capital of Israel? The answer is hypocrisy. That's an easy one. But what does that actually mean in the real world? What it means in the real world is that we're talking about systems here. Biden didn't come in to change and transform the US system. He's having to be pushed and prodded and pushed again and pushed again and pushed again to make any changes. And those changes are not systemic. It's going to take a very long time and a huge amount of work. So on the question of Palestine, what has changed, and this is a sequential process, first you have to change the public discourse. Eventually the media begins to change in reflection of that. And then eventually, much longer down the road, the policy discourse changes. And that's where we are on the question of Palestine. So just in this last week, Representative Betty McCollum from Minnesota introduced the first actual bill to protect Palestinian children and families from children's detention and the destruction of homes that would to be used with any use of US military aid. This is a first. Now it only has about 20 sponsors so far. It's just starting. And it's probably not, frankly, going to pass this year. But it's representative of a huge shift in that discourse so that protection and defense of Israel has become a thoroughly partisan issue. I've been looking at the polls that indicate a vast gap between Republicans and Democrats, not in Congress. In Congress, they're still pretty bipartisan on all this, but the voters are speaking a different language. And part of that, and I'll end with this part, is the two new reports that have come out, one just day before yesterday, and another about a month ago, one from the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, that for the first time for an Israeli human rights organization identified Israeli policy as apartheid from the river to the sea, including within Israel, within the Green Line, and within the occupied West Bank, occupied Gaza, and the occupied East Jerusalem. This is a huge shift for the most well-known and most respected internationally Israeli human rights organization. Day before yesterday, an even higher visibility report from this one from Human Rights Watch, which has been very, very reluctant over the years to wage serious criticism of Israel. For the first time, they have said Israel is guilty of the crime of apartheid, and that from the river to the sea, its goal is to establish Jewish supremacy over Palestinian lives. They didn't do that because they suddenly got the light because conditions on the ground are so bad. Conditions have been bad for a really long time. They were able to do it because they made an assessment of where public opinion is, what the political price would be, and they realized they were prepared for the first time to pay that political price if need be. And that's what's huge in this discourse shift. That's why the crackdown on particularly students in the Palestinian rights movement is so ferocious, because they're seen as vulnerable when we're winning victories on campuses, among the churches, in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, in all these ways, the victories are creating the backlash, and that's what we're dealing with here. The other thing I would just say very briefly on the question of sanctions. Sanctions are a huge issue, not only in Venezuela and Cuba, but as well in Iran, which we haven't had a chance to talk about, around the Iran nuclear deal. But the imposition of new sanctions on Iran, the escalation of sanctions in Venezuela in particular, have been horrific in terms of the impact on people's lives. For the first time in Venezuela, a wealthy country, children are dying for lack of completely treatable disease medicine. And in Iran, we've had for the first time in modern Iranian history, children dying for lack of food. Not very many so far, thankfully. This is not Yemen. But for the first time, this is a horrific reality. And what we need to do is build these anti-sanctions movements that are already underway, targeting particularly the sanctions in Venezuela and Iran. There are important movements already underway, led in some cases by people in Venezuela. It's more difficult for Iranians, but all of the work there, there's going to be a new resolution in Congress calling for an end to economic sanctions that has several members of Congress working together to figure out what language they're going to use. We need to support all of those moves. This is going to be a long-standing struggle because what we know is sanctions are not an alternative to war. They are an instrument of war.
Thank you, Phyllis, very much. Kari.
Yeah, I'll agree with all of that, everything my colleagues said, and I'll just, if I could speak, try to address some of these questions with a general point, which is actually that I've been surprised that given this work that we do on foreign policy, I've been feeling quite hopeful actually in terms of the opportunities that we have at the moment. Now, the hope doesn't come from from Biden or what he has indicated, but rather there's this really important and interesting convergence of a variety of factors that, yes, include the fact that the Biden administration is trying to distance itself from the Trump administration. It includes the fact, and therefore, kind of rhetorically uphold human rights. That offers an opportunity for those of us to say, who know what that means in reality, to say, well, here's what it would look like to uphold human rights: demilitarize, stop these wars, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing is that, the US is involved in these kind of intractable wars under the heading of the war on terror. And they're really not working. I mean, we know that from the perspective of humanity, from the perspective of the people who live in places like the Middle East and in Central Asia and in Africa, we know that these wars have been absolutely catastrophic. But even from the perspective of advancing US power and the missions attached to these different operations, that's actually not working. I mean, the conversation around withdrawal from Afghanistan is really telling, for example, where there are those who say, those within the halls of power in the US who say, well, I don't know if we can leave, and it's like, well, so it's been 20 years, like, is the suggestion that the US stay another 20 years? Like, what is the vision here? And the fact is they don't have a winning strategy. And that's actually true for a number of their operations. At the same time that, as John said, they're trying to orient on what they perceive to be a threat in the form of China. And so all these things are leading to some conversations in Washington where, there's some reevaluating happening. I think that the most significant thing, though, in so many ways, is actually there's this incredible conversation taking place in this country driven by the Black Lives Matter movement, which has forced a reckoning, or is forcing a reckoning, with the history of this country, systemic racism, the militarization of the police, and really the militarization of US society. And all these things are happening at the same time as there is more and more of a conversation about various aspects of US foreign policy, including US support for Israel, including the enormous military budget, including US support for the government of Honduras, which there's more of a conversation about. Biden says we want to address the root causes of immigration. Well, that again, that affords an opportunity for those of us who know a thing or two about what those root causes actually are, in the form of violence that the United States has supported, in the fact of economic arrangements that the United States has supported in Latin America and elsewhere that have made life unlivable for so many people, and in the form of climate change that is also displacing people. those are the root causes that we want to talk about. And so we will take the opportunity, thank you very much, if you put root causes on the table, to have a real conversation about what that means. But it really means us having our eyes wide open, actually building internationalist movements, that take on militarism. I think that, if we can do that and make some big pushes, there are big opportunities this year in terms of challenging US support for Israel. We should make a big push to close Guantanamo Bay. There is no reason why this military base in particular should remain open. We should make a big push on that this year, and any number of things. US policy toward Yemen, Iran, and we can go down the line. So let's keep at it.
Yeah, beautifully put, Kari. I want to turn to you, Basab, just on the climate question, but just one quick observation from all of our conversations at IPS. Over the last 3 years, as we've worked with the Poor People's Campaign, they've been putting forward that there are 4 giant interconnected injustices and crises. And for them, it has been poverty, inequality, systemic racism, militarism, and the climate and environmental crisis. We were all a little bit, and at IPS, we've loved that in those interconnections. We know it's complicated to talk about 4 interconnected crises. But to Kari's point, it's fascinating. Biden campaigns on 4 interconnected crises, which he even in some cases refers to, as we do, and the Poor People's Campaign does, in systemic terms. But his are COVID, so that's a new one, COVID and healthcare. The economy, he doesn't talk about poverty and inequality enough, but the economy. But he does say climate, and he does say systemic racism. The one he leaves out, of course, is what this whole panel has talked about, which is militarism, which they don't see as a crisis. And as everyone has talked about, it's sort of part of the fabric of how they approach the world. But Basab, one of them is climate. So at least that's a step in the right direction. Anything you want to say about the global climate aspects and the question that was raised?
So I want to put that question in a much broader context, which is this notion of so-called US global climate leadership, which certainly dates back to the Obama administration and even earlier, actually. And right away, I want to say that the notion of US global climate leadership is a load of garbage based on hubris, imperialistic hubris. The United States, I've already pointed out, is the world's largest producer of oil and gas. The US is also responsible for a staggering 25% of cumulative global greenhouse gas emissions. And cumulative emissions, and this is based on science, is not just about apportioning historical blame. It's because carbon dioxide in particular is a very chemically stable gas. And the excess CO2 in the atmosphere today, some of it dates back to the time of the Industrial Revolution. So literally, the United States is responsible for about 25% of the global warming impacts that we are seeing today. What does that mean? It means that instead of preaching climate leadership to the rest of the world, we should be providing a massive amount of funding, what we in movement circles call a fair share, for climate action in the global South, where the people there have contributed very little to the causes of climate change, but are facing some of the worst impacts. And number 2, it means re-envisioning our trade and investment policies. For instance, things like so-called investor-state dispute settlement in our trade agreements, and intellectual property provisions in our trade agreements, all of which act as roadblocks for poorer countries to be able to take the kind of action they need to take on climate change. Number 3, demilitarize. And this is not just because of the massive amount of resources that would free up for climate action, though that's certainly a factor. It's also about misplaced priorities. The fact that this country is willing to invest so much money in the machinery of death and then claims not to have enough resources to address the very real life and death existential crises facing the world today, which very importantly includes climate change. And then number 4, domestic climate policy is global climate policy. We have to cut our own greenhouse gas emissions with urgency, and the Biden administration's plan to cut 50% of US emissions by 2030 just doesn't cut it. Movements have been demanding a minimum of 70%. And that includes phasing out our domestic oil and gas production with a just transition for workers and communities who are dependent on extraction.
Thanks so much, Basav, and thanks to all of you. First, the panelists for laying out your analysis of Biden's first 100 days and really giving us, I think, a roadmap for work in this next period. Obviously, the next 3 months will be very much dominated by the plans that Karen started us with, the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan. But over the course of the next 4 years, all of these issues and these key international policy issues will be front and center. So, and to you, the audience, thank you so much. Many of you are longtime IPS allies and friends and supporters. Thanks for your active presence in both the chat box and also the questions and answers, and for being part of what we do. For those of you who are just getting to know IPS, please do visit us at ips-dc.org. Subscribe to our newsletters, Foreign Policy in Focus, inequality.org. You got 2 of the editors right here, to our overall newsletter. And there you will find out also the actions of core allies like the Poor People's Campaign and Caring Across Generations. We urge you to join their actions. The Poor People's Campaign is planning another giant virtual march on Washington in June. Please join that as well. Thanks for all of your support, all of you. Thanks for being part of the IPS community, and thanks for joining with us today. We'll see you soon, maybe after the second 100 days. Bye-bye.